So I've had several requests to do some videos on in the hoop embroidery projects. And if you've been following me for a while, you know I love to do in the hoop embroidery projects. So I thought I would attempt to video one. Now this takes a while to do because, well, I have to set up my equipment and everything else like that. And I'm bound to make some mistakes along the way, even though this particular design that you see in front of you right now is one that I'm going to do this time. Why am I going to do this particular one? Well, for several reasons. One is a selfish reason. You see my cupboard doors, they don't have much on them. My goal is to make enough of these, or another one anyways, to put on my cupboard doors in my sewing room, just to, add to my decor. I really like this one, how it turned out. I bought this pattern from I bought it from Creative Kiwi, which is a really great site, and I think they're out of New Zealand. And you can just buy their patterns. They're all fairly inexpensive, and download them directly to your computer and set up your embroidery machine with it. Now, I'm not going to explain that process because if you're watching this, you probably already know how to get embroidery designs from the internet and put them on your embroidery machine. It's fairly simple. So, the other reason I picked this design is because this is done in pieces, and you actually sew the pieces together in the hoop on your embroidery machine. So I'm going to show you how that works as well. Some embroidery designs that are in pieces, you have to make the pieces separate and then use your sewing machine to sew them together, which that works as well. But in this particular design, it's already laid out for your embroidery machine to do the work. Does this take a long time to do? Yes, it does. I'm not really sure. For you, the time will go by very fast because I'll be cutting, maybe speeding things up and that in the video. But you'll get to see the essential way an in the hoop project is done. So, first off, I want to talk a little bit about the supplies that I need. Now, as I said, this pattern came from Creative Kiwi. I purchased it, and they show you here on their instruction sheet. This comes as a PDF download along with your embroidery files, and it tells you step by step what to do. And inside, they always give you a list and variable sizes is the word I want for that. And I am going to concentrate on the 8x12 size. And it says for the front, back, and batting each, I need one 8.5 by 12 inch piece per hooping. And I believe in this design there are 3, possibly 4 hoopings. What's a hooping? A hooping is one part of the design. When it's done, you take it out of the hoop, you reset up your hoop for the next one, etc. So you build your design according to the number of hoopings. It also tells you if you want what kind of fabrics you need for each of these as well. Contrast fabric for full version. Full version means that there's 2 versions here. One that's an open design. Let me go up here. This is an open design, and the one that I have on display is a full design. Those center pieces that are a little bit lighter color of purple, those are already filled in, and that's the design I'm going to use today. So the instructions tell you what you need for fabric, and then it takes you through piece by piece as to how to put this together. And basically you just follow the steps and away you go. I think I have my pages out of order here, which I do. But for Creative Kiwi, patterns are very well written out. They're very detailed, and most of them have a YouTube tutorial that goes along with it, so you can watch each step of the way on YouTube. So that's all very helpful. I love Creative Kiwi for designs. I buy a lot of things from them. So I know what I need, and I'm just going to show you what I need. I need this hoop. It tells me when I put the embroidery file up on my embroidery machine, it tells me which hoop I should use. Now, I have an Janome 550E. It may be slightly different depending on what kind of machine you have, but essentially they all work the same. You need to hoop your fabric, your stabilizer, and follow the instructions. So I have a fairly large hoop here. This one I think is about 9 by 11, something like that. And I've put in a layer of tearaway stabilizer. That's what I'm going to be using for this particular pattern. And just as the name says, after you have done your design, you can take it out of the hoop and you can tear away this stabilizer, which is great. Now, it does call, though, for water soluble, I just noticed in the instructions. And I'm trying to think, it's been a while since I've done this one that's up here, whether I used water soluble stabilizer or used tearaway. I think I probably used water soluble. So right now in my hoop I have tearaway, but I think I'm going to put in water soluble. Water soluble means that when water hits it, it just dissolves, which is great. So I'm going to switch that out in a moment. Over here I have the fabrics. Now I picked two complementary colors, a red and a green. This could be a Christmassy type of project. But I picked these so that you'll be able to see the stitching a little bit more clearly. And I have cut out rough cut pieces that will be big enough for the design. I don't get too particular if it's a little bit over, more than I need, because you will be cutting it away as time goes on. You'll see how that works as well. I also have my batting. I'm using Battleizer. Battleizer is a low loft batting, which is great in table runners and things like that, that you don't want to be too fluffy, because, you know, if you're going to actually use it and put things on it, they might spill over if it's too fluffy. So I have pieces cut for that as well, according to what the instructions told me to cut. The last thing is I need to pick a thread, and I think I'm going to use a gold thread on this, and I'm going to use the same color for everything in this particular design, and that's another reason why I picked this. I will have less number of color changes to make. In fact, I won't have to change any color, and I need to check my supply to make sure this color that I am using right here, the yellow, that I have more of it in my drawer, because I'm going to go through quite a bit of that, and I'm pretty sure I do, because that's one of my standard colors I like to keep in stock. So with all that, I'm going to switch out and put in my water-soluble stabilizer into my hoop, and we'll get started. So I have taken out the stabilizer I had originally in the hoop and substituted the water-soluble stabilizer, and I'm using 2 layers of water-soluble stabilizer. I find that works a little better, because you've got to have something, especially in the initial stages of this design, for your thread to hold to, and I find that it's just a little bit more stable if I use 2 layers of water-soluble stabilizer. Now, where do I get my stabilizer? Well, stabilizer is expensive no matter where you buy it, but I have found that the stabilizer is sold by a Canadian site in Quebec called Monfil, monfil.ca, monfil.ca. They have a good selection of stabilizers, and I've used many of their stabilizers and never had any problem, and the price is great. I go through a lot of stabilizers, so I usually buy it by the 100-yard roll, which is about $100 for this one in particular. Sometimes they have sales. You may think, wow, that's expensive. Well, no, actually, if you work it out per foot, it is cheaper than what you may find in your local quilt stores. And Monfil is a great company, and I really like them a lot. So I do not get paid by Monfil to tell you that or anything. It's just, I'm just telling you what I use and what works for me. Also, I didn't mention the bobbin thread in my machine. I just use a white bobbin thread. Now, if you're really particular about how the back of your piece is going to look, you may want to use a matching thread. But I find 9 times out of 10, I can get away with just using a standard white bobbin thread. Again, I buy pre-wound bobbins from Monfil. Good value, work very, very well. I think they're 60 weight, and I use them for everything. I use them for quilt piecing as well, and I really like them. So I have found that I really don't need to change out my bobbin color to anything but just leave it out white, and it works fine for me. But you might want to, it depends on your taste and what you might want to do. So I have everything laid out here. I need to thread my machine with my gold colored thread, and then I'll show you what's coming up next. So I have loaded up my design, and this is the first piece of it, and I know this is the first piece because of what it says. in the file. This one is piece A, so it's the first piece that I need in this design. Now here on the screen you see the full design, what it's sort of going to look like without the color of your fabric when it gets all completely finished, this one piece. So this is hooping number 1. Now, I don't want to see the whole thing. I want to see it piece by piece. So I'm just going to push this button on my machine, and this is a Janome 550E as I told you, so it works this way. Yours may work differently if you have a different brand of machine. And this is showing me a basic outline of this first piece. And that is the placement stitch. That shows me where I'm going to need to put my fabric. And if I carry on down through here to the next one, now this shows me what looks the same, but that's the tack down for the fabric. And then this one is also a tack down, etc. Now, I'm a little confused at this point as to which one, what I'm supposed to do here with each thing. And even though I've done this before, it has been a while, so I'm going to have to go back to those instructions and see what it is they're asking for. And I believe that one of those first ones that I came up with after the line's drawn is to tack down the batting. So I'm just going to go to that part of my manual to make sure, or my instruction booklet, to make sure that I'm doing things in the right order. So the next step is to put down an outline in thread of where I'm going to lay my batting. So I'm going to do that now. I have it selected on my machine and everything is threaded. My foot is down. Let's go for it. Okay, so the next stage is to lay down my battleizer, or batting. I'm using battleizer. So I make sure that my piece is cut wide enough, long enough to cover that entire stitching, and put my foot down, and away we go. Oh, have a little problem here. This happens sometimes. It's telling me to rethread my needle and start again. Well, I don't think anything has come out, so I'm just going to go ahead with this. On an occasion, that will happen. Your thread will slip for some reason, or the machine, depending on your machine, will detect it thinks there's a thread break or it isn't threaded properly. So you just go in, rethread the machine, or what I did here is I could see that my thread was all right. It had just slipped through the fabric, or through the batting, and it's fine. So I just restarted it and away it went. And you notice this time, this is what's called a tack down stitch. What it's doing is it's going over that stitch line twice. It just makes it a little bit more secure, and it's going to make it easier for cutting away that batting, which I'm going to show you as soon as this is finished how that works. And for that, you're going to need a special pair of scissors, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment. Now I've taken the hoop off the machine, but I do not take the hoop apart. You leave everything intact, so you want to be careful when you're taking it off your machine that you don't accidentally pop your hoop open, because if you do that, you're going to have to start all over again, because trying to get it lined up again, put it back in, you might be able to do it, but 9 times out of 10 it's just easier to cut your losses and carry on. So what am I going to use? Well, I have a special pair of scissors right here, as you can see. These are called duck bill applique scissors because of their shape. And these are the best scissors, I think, for cutting away fabric close to the stitch line, because I now have to cut the batting away, but I don't want to cut my stitch lines, but I only want to leave about 1/8 of an inch at the most all the way around. So that's what I'm going to do here right now. So I just carefully pull it up, and as I'm cutting, I can kind of take these scissors and press them very close to the stitch line. You'll feel it. And then if you tug on it just gently, because you don't want to pull it out of the hoop, you can cut all of this off very close to the stitching line. Now, as I said, you want to be about 1/8 of an inch away, and that'll be fine because that 1/8 of an inch that's hanging over from the stitching will get buried in the future stitching that happens on this, because there will be things like more stitch lines for fabric lay down and then satin stitching to secure things. So don't worry about it if it's not quite even, but you do want to get it as close as you possibly can. Also, one of the reasons I like using battleizer, because it's low loft, is for this stage as well, because I find that if I use regular batting, there's more fibers and the tips of my scissors get caught in the fibers, and it just makes cutting it out a little bit more difficult. Not impossible. Now, if by accident you happen to cut into your stitches, don't panic, because as I said, this is going to be stitched over the top of, again, just as long as everything is being held securely in the hoop. And there you go, all cut out. So I'm going to return it to the machine, and I'm going to do the next stage. And the next stage is, and I'm looking at the extension. Okay, it says on here there are 2 places you can now add the backing fabric. At the beginning now, all the quilting will show on the reverse side. You will need to use matching bobbin threads after the quilting stitch. This is what I added in my sample. She says, the person who did this. So I think I did on that one, I think I did it after the fact. Because I didn't want to see the stitching coming through. So I'm going to do that after the fact. So put it back in, and then I put down my first major color. That will be my red. This one that I've already pre-cut. This is going to go over top of what I've already stitched here, making sure I have a generous amount left on the edges at the top and the bottom and the sides, because I am going to cut that away and I want something to hang on to. And I'm going to stitch the outline for that. Yeah, so let me get that on the machine and show you what that looks like. Okay, so I have my first fabric on, and I now need to tack that down, so I'm going to do that now. Now, you might say, well, why am I using my main color of thread? Why not use a more neutral thread? It really doesn't matter. It's up to you. The reason I'm not going to bother is less times I have to change out my thread, and which takes up time. And also, this is going to be covered up anyways when I get the satin stitches onto it, so I'm not particularly worried about what color it is. It just makes life a little easier, because there's been many times when I have stitched things down and I have forgotten to change my thread. So again, here it goes. It's going around for the second time to make this a very secure cutting line, so that it's easier to do. That's one thing I like about Creative Kiwi patterns. They are very, very well designed to make your life a lot easier and to make your final product very substantial. So we'll let this finish out, and I'll show you what's going to happen next. Now the next set of instructions say to place your contrasting fabric, which is the part that's going to go in those center spots that are marked here on top of this. There is no need to take the hoop out at this point. You're not going to cut anything away at this point. You're just putting another layer of fabric down on top of this. So I raise my foot and I just slide my fabric under that. Again, there is going to be some waste here, but I would rather have more fabric than not enough to make sure all my spots are covered. And they are. And now I'm just going to stitch the next pattern, which is just going to fill in those little spots, and that's how I'll know where to cut this top fabric away. Oops, gotta put my foot down. So once again, I've taken my hoop off the machine, being careful not to dislodge the hoops themselves, and I'm going to cut away that green fabric from the spots that are outlined, and I'm cutting them on the outside of the line, not the inside. I want fabric to be on the inside of those lines. And once again, I'm using my duck-billed scissors, and I'm being careful not to cut the fabric underneath, just the fabric around each one of these pieces, as I'm doing here. Again, get as close to the thread line as you can without cutting it. And you're going to want to, be right up against it if you can. If you leave about 1/8 of an inch, that's fine. Now your thread, I find my fabric, depends on your fabric, but of course, fabric does what fabric does, and that is to fray. That's okay. I cut off the extraneous stitches there. There'll probably be more. And once I get all of this cut away, as I am doing right now, I'm going to take a lint roller and just go over all this to pick up any little bits or pieces, little stray threads, things like that, that are on my fabric, because I don't want those to get caught in the stitching. Not that it would necessarily wreck it, but you don't want extra fiber hanging out from your appliqué design. Now here you see I haven't got quite as close, so I'm just going to come in with my scissors. These scissors are excellent. I highly recommend that if you're going to do this kind of embroidery, that you invest in a pair of duck bill appliqué scissors, because they're a little expensive. They're about $35 or $40, but they're well worth the investment. So I'm going to carry on and get this all cleaned up, and I'll show you what the next stitching is. So I have all these little pieces cut out, as you can see, and I've got my lint roller, and I've got some little pieces of frayed threads on here. I just take my lint roller and very gently roll over the top of it, and if it pulls up another thread or two here, I just pull those out. If there's a couple of little threads that are poking up, don't worry too much about them. They'll get buried in the satin stitch. And then you're going to say, well, look at all the wasted fabric. No, this is not wasted, because when I do the next block or the next hooping, some of these pieces I'll be able to lay down. I don't have to cover the whole thing in the contrasting color. I can use pieces from that, because the next ones are going to be this size as well. So yeah, there isn't as much waste as you might think. And there's just a couple of more stray little threads. Take those off. So I'm going to return it to the embroidery machine and show you the next step. Now this next part of the design is going to put a zigzag stitch around each one of those green pieces as well, just to secure them. So that's what we'll do now. And you see, with this stitch, if there are any little frayed pieces sticking up, they'll probably be caught in the zigzag stitch, and that'll hold them down and bury them, and that'll be fine. So it's going to do this for each one of these little pieces. So I'm going to let it finish that up, and then we'll go to the next part of the design. Now, what the machine is going to do, and this is an option, but I like the option, it's going to do a little bit of what looks like quilting inside each one of these green pieces. So I'm going to let the machine go ahead with that. And you can see this is just adding a little bit of quilting inside all of this, which will give it a bit of texture. You can, in this particular design, opt out of that, but many of the in the hoop designs, because they are meant as a quilting kind of applique design, do have the quilting stitches built right into them. And I usually use them because I think it adds a lot to your final design. But usually they're optional. So we'll let that do it. It's going to do the same thing to all the other pieces as well. Now the next set of stitches are continuing with the quilting, but into the burgundy section, which are straight line. And I'm just going to get that going. So this is going to go ahead and do this area and all these other areas around this. You'll note that we have not yet cut the fabric, and that's on purpose, and that's at another stage that we'll come to. So I'll show you that in a moment. But essentially that is done the same way, following the stitching line on the outside of this to get the excess fabric away. But you can see here it does a beautiful job of the quilting. Probably a lot more accurate than most of us could do on our own. So really, it's almost a quilt as you go kind of project as well. So at this point, we're going to flip the hoop over. We've taken it away from the machine. Carefully flip it over to the back side. And you can see what that back side looks like right now. It's not pretty, but that's okay. We're going to cover that up. So we have it down. And we're going to take a piece of fabric that we're going to use for backing fabric, and I've cut a piece already, and you'll notice that it is the same as the color I used on the front, but it's up to you what you want to use. Now this is bigger than the hoop itself, so what I think I may do is just move it over to the edge of the hoop, and I'm going to trim a little bit off the side. I don't want to take too much off because this is a large piece of fabric and it needs to be secured. And let's see, I'm going to take a little bit off the bottom as well. You'll understand why in just a second. Now smooth it out, and yes, I do press my fabrics before I put them on the hoop. Okay, we'll make sure that's covering everything that it should be. Okay, now, because this is on the back and I have to flip this back over, I'm going to use some masking tape just to hold it down. And that's why I cut it the way that I did. So I'd have some surface where I can put my tape. You could use painter's tape, but I find masking tape is just a little bit stickier and holds things a little bit more securely than painter's tape. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to return this to the machine. Very carefully make sure none of this fabric flips up, because that can happen, and that's the point of having masking tape, to keep your fabric from accidentally flipping up when you put it back to the machine and getting stitched in here. You don't want that. If it happens, you can get around it. Usually you can do some picking, but if you don't have to pick, why bother? So I'm going to put this back on the machine. Okay, it's back on the machine, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the next stitch sequence, and that's going to secure from the front my backing fabric to this. So essentially what it's doing is it's just going around the outside perimeter of the design, and that will secure my backing fabric to this. And then later we'll be cutting this away. Okay, so once again, I have removed the hoop from the machine. Yes, there are many times when you have to remove the hoop from the machine. Some people try to cut the fabric or the pieces while it's in the hoop. I find it very awkward. It's just easier to take the whole thing off your machine and do it there. Just be careful, as I've said before, don't pop your hoops out of each other. Then you have a problem. So we've got to cut away the fabric on the front and the fabric on the back. It doesn't matter what order you do this in. I'm going to start at the back, and you can see I have my outline here, so I know exactly where to cut. I'm going to remove my masking tape. If you want to be frugal, you can probably reuse the masking tape. I throw caution all to the wind. I'm not going to bother. And I'm just going to do with my duck bill applique scissors, just the way I've done it before. Again, I want to get within 1/8 of an inch or less close to my thread without cutting my sewn line. So we just go all the way around. I actually find this stage of cutting kind of relaxing. I don't know why. It's a bit of an annoyance, but there's no way around it that I've ever seen. So you just take your time. I find if you tug on the fabric just a little bit, not enough to pull it out of the hoop, but it allows you to get your scissors in much closer. And in fact, your scissors will probably, if they're sharp enough, just glide around most of these pieces. And I find on curves especially, that is very handy. So we're just trimming it all off. Again, we're going to have some leftovers here. Now these leftovers, for this project, I don't believe I'm going to be able to use those. But if the chunks are big enough, put them in your scrap pile, as we do. Now, I've just noticed here, I've got maybe a little too much over in the overhang, so I'm just going to go back in and do a little snip. Again, these scissors allow me to get that close to it. And there's some miscellaneous threads on here, so I'm just going to use my lint roller to get those. Now you may notice right down here, I don't know how well it shows up, but there's kind of a bird's nest, a little small one. Don't worry about that. That's going to get buried in the satin stitch that's going to go over top of this in one of the next stages. And now I'm just flipping it over, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I'm just going to cut all the way around the outside of this. Okay, so I have my front and my back all cut out, and now I can return it to the machine. And it's going into its last series of stitching, which is basically the satin stitch that goes around all the inside pieces and the outside pieces. It will start with a zigzag just to secure everything a little bit more, and then it'll do the zigzag stitch, and it's going to be in that same color I've been using, the gold. Again, you could change the colors to whatever you want, but this is what I'm using for this project. And I'll get that on the machine and let you see the beginning of that. So here we go with the zigzag stitch. Puts this around the perimeter of the larger piece, the burgundy piece, just as an extra secure. And this is where if there's any of those little frayed pieces, little tiny ones that are still popping up, they should get buried under those. And then it's going to go around the whole pattern with a zigzag stitch, including those green pieces on the inside. And that will finish up the first piece. So we are all done part A of this. So what we need to do is take it out of the hoop, cut away the stabilizer, and I'll talk about that in a moment because there's another step involved with this. But in the meantime, I want to point out a couple of things to you. If you take a look at this satin stitching that's here, and you'll notice it adds this little decorative feature to the satin stitching as well, which is something I also like about Creative Kiwi designs because they just go one step a little further, and I think that looks really nice. But one other thing you're going to notice, I do not have satin stitching around this area in here. And why is that, you may ask? That's because that's where we're going to join part B to part A. So when we get this cut out, we want to make sure that these are really straight with very little overhang of fabric on here. And I'll be showing you how you join the two pieces a little bit later on in this video. But right now, the next thing we're going to do is take it out of the hoop. And now there's two things you can do. Since we want to cut away the stabilizer, I could take my applique scissors and before taking it out of the hoop, just go in and cut around this. The only danger here is you do not want to cut into your satin stitch, because if you do, you're screwed. No, that's just it. It'll all start to unravel. And I have done this. Ask me how I know. And can you fix it? Well, yes and no. You might be able to backtrack a little bit on your embroidery design to that section, have it do the satin stitch over top of it, but then you're going to have one part of your stitching that could be a bit of a bulge. It may not show up that much, but it's just annoying. So I'm not going to do it this way. I'm going to take it out of the hoop, and basically I'm just going to cut around the whole design. And I'm leaving probably, oh, 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch around it. So it's a rough cut. And I'm avoiding the satin stitches. So you can see it's just a very rough cut. And I'll explain what I'm going to do with this in a moment, as soon as I get this cut out. Now remember, I'm using something called water-soluble stabilizer. And just as the name implies, this stabilizer, when it gets wet, will dissolve. It is essentially a glue. And so I'm just now trimming up a little bit closer. I'm just trying to get as much off of this as I possibly can before I go to the next stage. And what's the next stage, you're probably asking? Well, I'm going to take it to a sink. I'm going to fill the sink with some warm, not boiling hot, warm tap water. I'm going to submerge this into that, and this is going to dissolve all of the stabilizer away. Now, another way you can do it is to take a Q-tip, dip it in a little cup of water, and just go around the edges, and that'll work too. But you want to know something? That's time consuming, and I don't want to do that. So I'm going to plunge it into the sink of water. I'm just going to swish it around. It takes about 25 seconds to 30 seconds for this to start to dissolve, and then take it out. I will then take a couple of sheets of you know, as they call it in English, in England, kitchen towel, paper towels, and I'll just blot it between those two. I might take my iron and just lightly press it as well to help the drying process, and leave it laying flat. And in about an hour or so, it'll be completely dry. Now, depending on how much of this material, of the water soluble, how long you soak it in the sink, the more will come out. And it'll make this very soft. But I don't want it necessarily to be that soft, because it's going to go up on my cupboard doors, as I said at the beginning of this video. I want it to be reasonably stiff. So I'm going to leave some of the water soluble stabilizer in between the layers in here. I'm not going to dissolve it all. And so when it dries, it will be a little bit on the stiff side, and that's okay. But you can adjust that according to how long you submerge it in the water. Now, of course, one of the cautions here is make sure your fabric doesn't bleed. You don't want that. But since you're not probably going to do much agitation of it, you're just putting it in the water, letting it dissolve, taking it out, you'll probably be okay. But if you're in doubt, always test your fabric beforehand to see if it is, run proof. So I'm going to take this off to the sink, do what I said I'm going to do, and I'll be back. So here's the finished piece. I have it laying flat to dry. I'm not going to keep it in this spot because it's going to be in my way, but I have another area that I can lay it down. All the stabilizer is out of it, as you can see. Here's what the back looks like. Looks very nice. Of course, it has these edges, but those, don't worry about those. Those are going to be where we're going to join the next piece. So it's coming along very nicely. Now, you might want to know how long it took to do that one piece. It took about 45 minutes to an hour. Of course, it wasn't that long for you to watch this because I cut the video at certain spots. But yeah, these are a project that you can do them in a day, but you may want to come back to them as well. You may not have a half a day to work on this, or, well, basically there's 4 pieces, so, roughly 4 hours. to do this kind of thing. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go away. I'm going to do the next 3 pieces in this design, and at one point I will show you how to they are joined together using the embroidery machine, and we'll talk about that then. And now comes the tricky part. We've got to put part A and attach it to part B. And so the way we do that is, and you see here I have part A, and where the raw edges are, you have to line them up with the raw edges on the piece that's in the hoop. So you butt them up, you don't overlap them, but you want to butt them up very close. And how are you going to get them to stay like this? What's going to happen is it's going to put a joining stitch in around in this area. So you take a piece of your masking tape. Masking tape is your friend. And you line it up close to the edge. And stick some tape where the line of stitching will not go, because then you'd be stitching your tape down. And I need it to fit in here. Now that looks pretty good, but I'm going to put a little piece of tape right here as well. Just reinforce that. Okay, so I'm looking at all these edges here to make sure it's butted up. Oops. No, it wasn't butted up properly. You may also want to have a stiletto in your hand for this. Now that piece is not yet lined up. And this is what I meant. It's a little tricky. You got to get everything lined up. Some little pieces here that I see are hanging out. So I'm just going to clip those. Okay, now you want to turn the speed down on your embroidery machine to its slowest speed for this. So I need to go into my settings to do this and just find where the speed is. There it is. So I'm going right down to 400 stitches per minute from 860, which is its max. Okay, I'm going to grab my stiletto. You don't want to put your hands in here. And basically hope for the best. Now, I'm noticing this part up here is a little cockeyed. So I'm going to start it here, but I'll probably stop the machine. And would you know it, it says my bobbin thread may not be enough. So that means I have to take the hoop off, put in a new bobbin thread. This always happens when you need it the most, and get it resituated. So I'll be back. Okay, I have a new bobbin in my machine. I've realigned everything. Actually, I found it was easier if I removed the hoop from the machine, did the realignment on a flatter surface, and yeah, that was just a little easier. So here we go. I've got my speed slowed right down, and it should do a zigzag across this to join the pieces. And I'm just using my stiletto to make sure everything is where it should be. Now I'm just taking a look here to see if I missed or not. I don't like the way this piece is joined. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut my thread. And I'm just going to move my hoop out of the way here. Or in fact, yeah, okay, let's just see what I need to do. Yeah, that piece did not join properly there. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to realign it. And that means I'll have to take it off here and do that. So I took it off the hoop, and I didn't take it out of the hoop. I just took the whole hoop off the embroidery machine. That's important to know. And I clipped with my applique scissors the stitching that had already happened. That was a zigzag stitch, which is basically to join the two pieces together. And it was off on this one piece near the bottom. So I have realigned it, retaped it, put it back in the machine, and we're going to try this again. And don't panic if that happens to you. And the very first time you do one of these, it probably will. Although I've done this before, so it shouldn't have happened to me. But it did. And here we go. Try again, round 2. Now I'm just going to stop it for a second and remove my tape here so that I don't sew over my tape. If I did, you could still get it off. You just have to poke at it with a pair of tweezers, and I'd rather not if I can avoid that. Okay. So my join is all sewn, and I'm just taking a look at it to make sure that my zigzag stitch is attached to both pieces. When I'm satisfied with that, I can take the rest of the tape off. And now we'll finish it with the satin stitch that will go over those joined pieces and other pieces here that didn't have a satin stitch before. So we'll just go to that, and away we are. Go. And so we'll let this play out, and that's how you join the pieces together. And you'll do the same procedure with the other 2 pieces that we have yet to make. And then that will give us the whole thing done. Now, I will have to remove the stabilizer from this piece, and I think I'm going to try doing that using more of the Q-tip method, because I really don't want to dunk this whole thing, although I can, I'll see, in the sink. Because I'm making this video over the course of a couple of sessions, and so it will have plenty of time to dry before I get to the point where I want to put the 3rd section onto this. But we'll see. I'll come back when this is finished so you can see what it looks like. And yes, you can see that it is still working on the satin stitch. It hasn't finished up yet. This is a fairly long process because there's a lot of satin stitches to be done here, and I do have it on the slowest speed, but it's better to keep it at the slowest speed when you're going over those join parts than a faster speed, just in case there's a problem. Okay, so the second piece has been secured to the first piece, and the satin stitching is done, and so this half of the table runner is all done. So I'm going to remove it from the hoop, take it out, cut away the excess stabilizer, do all of that. Then I'm going to make the next 2 pieces, and I'm going to join them in the same manner as you saw me join piece B to piece A. And then essentially at that point, our table runner is done. So I'll be back to show you the finishing process. And it is done. So I've attached the last 2 pieces to this, and I have dissolved all the water-soluble stabilizer, and you can see now my table runner is all done. And those last two parts, I just did exactly what I did with the first two parts in terms of sewing them out and for attaching them. And it turned out pretty nice. And if you want to see the back of it, there is the back of it. So in a sense, this is reversible, I guess. But anyways, this is going to go up on my cupboard doors. And yeah, I hope that took some of the mystery out of how you do in the hoop applique or in the hoop project. I may do some other different types of ones down the road, so stay tuned for that.